Phosphorus Platform, and we're lucky today to have the participation of the Secretariat of that platform, Chris Thornton, who's going to bring us up to date on the status of that effort and things that are happening in Europe with respect to all these issues. Chris.
So thank you, Matt, thank you, Jim, and thank you for PRCN for getting me here, inviting me to speak at this meeting, and congratulations on bringing so many people together to work on phosphorus again. We did it 2 years ago, and I think there are more people here today. It's a growing interest, and that's really positive. So the European Sustainable Phosphorus Platform is a member-funded, not-for-profit organization, bringing together industry, public bodies, research institutes. So these are our members here. Some of the names you may know. You'll see in there the fertilizer industry, both Fertilizers Europe, who are the mineral fertilizer association in Europe, and also some individual companies, TMAC, Roulier, who are suffering from the being cut off the bottom syndrome, and ICL Fertilizers, one of the bigger companies, but also Ital Polina, who are one of the biggest European organic fertilizer producers. So already producing fertilizers from materials like food waste, manure, food industry wastes, and so on. But also the water treatment companies. Lippe is a German public-private water treatment group. Suez and Veolia, which may be names you know. And the chemical industry, who are very interested in some of the high-value products you can make by recycling phosphorus. And then a number of technology suppliers, public institutes, and so on. I'm going to go very rapidly through the first part. This is the drivers for why we're interested in sustainable phosphorus. We've heard about this from PRCN. In Europe, we see 3 drivers: the environmental drivers, the supply security, and particularly the economic opportunities and the circular economy, the possibility to create jobs. That's very much what's driving things at the moment. When you talk to politicians about environment, it's a constraint. When you talk to them about generating rural jobs in areas, not in cities, but in rural areas, increasing farmers' net income, then they listen. The environmental drivers, phosphorus is beyond its planetary boundaries, as is nitrogen, eutrophication, which has already been mentioned by the people from PRCN. I think one of the things which is interesting is that the issues are very much the same in Europe and in North America. These are the maps of the eutrophication impacted areas, and we both have key areas which are driving things. Here it's the Great Lakes, it's Chesapeake Bay, and there's been a lot of work on those. In fact, other areas are also impacted, but those kind of the big visionary ones. In Europe, there's the Baltic Sea, which is an enclosed sea which has big eutrophication problems, Lake Geneva, and a number of other areas. So things are in many ways similar between the US and North America and Europe. The resource supply drivers has been mentioned, discussed with Dana, so I'll skip over that. The economic drivers are very much what are taking things forward. There's a synergy between managing phosphorus better and a lot of things which are happening anyway or which need to happen. Improving sewage treatment, reducing ammonia emissions, which is a key issue in Europe at the moment. Ammonia contributes to particulates and therefore contributes to health issues. I think it's 3/4 of the particulates in Milan, despite the Italian drivers, are caused by the agriculture because it's an intensive livestock area. So there's a recent new European directive on ammonia emissions, and that will drive also phosphorus. I know and you know there's no phosphorus in ammonia, but they go together. Food waste management, that will also generate a source for phosphorus recycling. Distributed sanitation, eco-san, water reuse. If you want to reuse the water, what happens to the phosphorus in it? Restoring soil carbon, the recent 1 in 4,000 commitment in Paris to help agriculture address climate change by fixing carbon in the soil. Organic carbon is often linked to phosphorus. And as I said, the circular economy, that's very much one of the driving forces in Europe. The regulatory context in Europe, a lot is going on. Regulation drives things. Without the regulation, things may not happen because they're not economic. If a regulation comes in place, it happens. If there wasn't regulation requiring sewage works and sewage treatment, there probably wouldn't be many sewage works. A few cities might have said, this is really nice, let's install them. But most sewage treatment is there because you have no choice. So Europe started working on that line later than the US, because you mentioned 1970s. The key regulations at the European level, at least, are the early 1990s, the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, sewage treatment, the Nitrates Directive, which is interesting because the word phosphorus does not occur at all, but which in fact increasingly impacts phosphorus management because, of course, the two are linked. So you've got a directive which doesn't address phosphorus, which is strongly addressing manure phosphorus. Those were brought together in the Water Framework Directive in the year 2000, which basically says that all water bodies in Europe should achieve good ecological quality by about 2015. That was quite ambitious, and we haven't got there yet. But it's continuing to drive things, and the value of it is that it's integrated. It's not end of pipe. It's find the overall solution which enables you to get there. And the Groundwater Directive, interestingly, recently in 2006, has added phosphorus to one of the substances you must monitor. So phosphorus is in eutrophication, but it's also an issue for groundwater. Other policies. The supply issue is important in Europe. Europe is concerned because it's dependent on imports. It's concerned about possible fluctuations in price. And that resulted in 2014 in phosphate rock being added to the list of 20 critical raw materials. That doesn't have an immediate regulatory effect, but it drives future regulations because phosphate rock is up there with the precious metals that are essential to use mobile phones. So it's getting across the message that actually your phosphate fertilizer is maybe as important as your mobile phone. And as I think you said at the beginning, that's not actually an obvious message today. The EU launched in 2015 discussions of developing a circular economy policy. The objective is to use our own resources in waste. So the jobs are in Europe recycling rather than importing resources, which make us economic dependent, and where the jobs producing those resources are outside Europe. What is interesting is in the public consultation on the circular economy policy, a very significant proportion of the respondents flagged up bionutrients. That's not my term, it's the term European Commission put in the consultation. And phosphorus as being something which was a key circular economy aspect to develop. You know, we all think precious metals, paper, glass, copper. Well, an increasing number of people are actually thinking nutrients and phosphorus. That has led today to a major piece of regulation which is occupying a disproportionate amount of my time, but even more time for the fertilizer industry and the others I'm working with, the water industry, which is the new EU Fertilizers Regulation. The current regulation only covers mineral fertilizers. The future regulation, if we ever get there, will cover composts, digestates, soil improvers, struvite, biochar, you name it. That's important because it will open a European market for those products. At the moment, if you authorize your struvite in France, then you have to start again and do another dossier in Portugal, in Portuguese, and so on. But of course, it will also open the market for the technologies. You can't sell a technology to produce a product if you can't actually then sell the product. A very complicated piece of legislation currently in Parliament and in Council, things still going on, discussions about traceability, many issues remaining, so I can't tell you what it will actually look like when it's finished, but hopefully it will be somewhat improved from what it looks like at the moment, and I think that will really take things forward. As well as European policies, we're like the US. We have the federal level we have the feds, and we have the states. And a number of member states are doing things, and some of them are maybe less enthusiastic. Some of them are ahead of the European level. The two key leaders at the moment are Switzerland and Germany. Switzerland has introduced legislation which will make phosphorus recovery from sewage and slaughterhouse wastes obligatory. The ordinance defining what percentage, whether it's 97% of the phosphorus or 5%, is still pending, should be out soon, and as soon as that's out, then people will start investing in the technology. There's 10 years to implement it. If you don't recover the phosphorus, you can landfill your product so that you can dig it out later and recover the phosphorus, but clearly that makes no economic sense. It's better to recover the phosphorus now than spend a lot of money landfilling it, digging it out later. Germany is in the process of enacting the same sort of legislation requiring phosphorus recovery from all sewage works bigger than 50,000 people, if I remember rightly, as person equivalent. That's about 2/3 of German sewage. The text is basically finalized. It went through, I can't remember whether it was Senate or Parliament last week, and should be promulgated within a couple of months. There's a lot going on in Scandinavia. As I mentioned, it's around the Baltic, so there's a strong motivation there. A number of Scandinavian countries don't have actual policies requiring to do this end of pipe, but they have overall policies with objectives for certain levels of phosphorus recovery. So Finland, Sweden, Denmark, and those gradually filter through into regulation. HELCOM is important. It's the Baltic Sea Commission, which brings together 9 countries around the Baltic, and that includes Russia, which is not yet part of the European Union, but maybe it'll come in when the UK leaves. There's a HELCOM recommendation which requires phosphorus recovery and requires the member states to monitor how much phosphorus they're recovering. And a HELCOM recommendation, despite the vocabulary, is actually obligatory. So it's called a recommendation, but it's actually obligatory. So this will also be quite a powerful regulatory driver. We're doing a lot of work on standards, normalization standards. That's actually very important. A number of people have said it's no good having a nice technology if you produce a product that farmers don't actually want. And the standards enable you to say that your product fits a certain number of requirements, delivers nutrients in a certain condition, fits into the farmer's spreading material, spreading equipment, you know. And so work is ongoing on standards. SEN, which is the official European standards body, published a paper last year as to what standards were needed to take phosphorus recovery forward. And we're currently involved in a standards working group on sustainability and recycling for green chemicals. So there's a range of things going on standards. More will come with the fertilizer regulation, which will lead to standardization of other recycled products. And then there's a whole range of other initiatives ongoing. BAT-BREFs, for instance, are the documents which define what environmental processes you must have in factories to ensure environmental respect. And over the last couple of years, phosphorus recovery in the form of struvite has been introduced into those documents for food processing and for piggeries and chickens. Not as obligatory, but as a recommended technology which hopefully will, well, likely lead to implementation and maybe lead to it becoming obligatory in the next round of updates. So I'd like to finish with a number of success stories. I haven't used the Italian thing that I can never meda cotta, but a young lady who's near where I am, near Lyon in France, who has got a product called La Belle Bouse, which in French basically translates as beautiful shit. A bouse is a unique French word meaning it's the beautiful cowpat. It's the bouse is a cowpat. So she's marketing it as a recycled organic product. So that's just one little thing. Somewhat bigger scale, Coppel, which is the biggest French pig cooperative, They're already, the pig farmers in Brittany, Cupbale is not all of them, but a lot of them are part of the Cupbale Cooperative. They're currently recycling around 400,000 tons of manure per year. Composted poultry litter, dried poultry manure, and pig manure. And increasingly what they're doing is solid liquid separation on the farm, anaerobic digestion to stabilize, and then they're pelletizing it, mixing it with other nutrients to get a product which is adapted to soya, which is adapted to sunflower, and then moving it to a different bit of France where it's adapted for the farmer's needs. One interesting thing in the economic model is that it's Cupbale who are producing the manure, who are paying for the sheds for the farmers in the sunflower area, because this stuff is much more bulky than mineral fertilizer, and of course the pigs will insist on producing manure 12 months a year instead of just for a couple of weeks when you need the fertilizer. And so there's a storage problem. And so it's the manure producers who are paying for the storage costs, because in the end it's driven by the obligation to treat the manure. There is a value to this, but it's not a value higher. The farmers are interested in the organic content, but farmers will all tell you they want the organic content, but actually getting a farmer to pay for the organic content is not easy. Another example, the Friesland Milk Cooperative in the Netherlands, they're setting up a system where they actually pay the farmers more for their milk production if they're managing their manure properly. And that's to ensure that they're respecting regulation and that they can continue operating. Italpolena, who are one of our members, one of the biggest European organic farmer fertilizer producers, manufacturing a range of fertilizers from a range of secondary products. So this is already happening. And they're producing 200,000 tons a year. So this is not garage level innovation. This is happening full scale. And the fertilizer regulation will facilitate this, enable these technologies and these companies to work across Europe. Another full-scale case, Fibrofos in the UK. They're processing 800,000 tons a year of chicken litter. The driver has been energy feed-in tariffs, because they get a renewable energy tariff when they burn the stuff and produce energy. But when you burn chicken litter, I'm not quite sure where the nitrogen goes. Don't ask. But the phosphorus and the potassium come out in the ash, which is basically a pretty good fertilizer product. Needs a bit of pelletizing, but doesn't need any chemical processing. Saria Calphos in the UK, slightly smaller scale, only 12,000 tons a year. This is meat and bone meal ash, which has been a traditional phosphate fertilizer for 150 years or so, and still is. There are companies in Finland, but there are other companies in Europe where this is not possible because of regulatory obstacles. So sorting that out is also important. The example of struvite, no one has actually handed round any recovered phosphorus. So this is from a sewage works in the UK. Many of you have probably seen it before. So this is magnesium ammonium phosphate. It says don't eat on it, because it's near lunchtime. Probably it's not toxic to eat it, but I'm still there to test you. You try it. So that is precipitated downstream of the digesters in Slough Sewage Works in the UK. The film at the bottom was Al Jazeera, who did a nice 20-minute feature on this phosphorus recycling. Thames did some very good marketing. This stuff is sold by Ostara at a relatively high price to high-level markets like golf courses, first division football clubs in the UK. That's their marketing. Other people produce struvite and sell it more cheaply. But the main driver is not the price of the struvite. The driver is that this resolves a sewage works operating problem, because the phosphate precipitates somewhere. It also significantly improves sludge dewatering, which for sewage works is a really big cost. TMAC and other of our members are taking this product, I'm not sure they're taking it from Astara, but from Neurosis and others, and they're processing to make a starter fertilizer for maize, which is delivered near the root. It's not actually water-soluble, so it's not a traditional fertilizer, and people have spent the last 15 years telling me that struvite doesn't work as a fertilizer because it's not water-soluble, and you have to change the way people think. Plants can actually get at it to the extent that it can be used as a starter phase for maize, for what you call corn, which is really where you need the nutrients fast. You know, this is not pine trees. This is something which needs the nutrients in a few weeks. ICL fertilizers are looking at a different approach of taking various ashes, sewage sludge incineration ash, meat and bone meal ash, putting it into their fertilizer process where there's still some acid, so it acidulates it, and then using it in fertilizer production. There are some operating difficulties, one of which is simply handling, but that's moving forward. More upstream, Revac in Sweden is working on a quality certification scheme for biosolids. The best way in terms of nutrients and organic carbon is to spread the biosolids on the fields rather than processing them. So a very different route from Switzerland. And this is interesting because it's working with the supermarkets to try and maintain that field use and address concerns about quality and contaminants. Another system rather different. Again, this is at the sink, taking out fish from the Baltic and recycling them. So that's basically what I want to say. I've got a couple of slides about the platform, but I think there's a leaflet outside, looks like this, which tells you about us, and if you want further information, grab me over lunch.
Thank you, Chris. I think we have time for questions before we get break for lunch. So fire away. A lot of technologies there you might be curious about.
Very interested in, I'm sorry, Doug Myers, the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. I'm very interested in, since the local rural jobs is such a driver, in any of the presentations you've put together on this, do you have job numbers to share along with the other statistics? Because this crowd's very interested in the nuts and bolts of phosphorus recovery, but can you translate each of these success stories into the jobs number that's so interesting for folks?
It's a key question. We actually did a calculation, so there's a kind of two-page paper where we've put some figures, which is on our website, but to be very honest, it was kind of something we did on the back of an envelope. And what we think would be good is to pay McKinsey or one of the other people who would charge 50,000 euros to do the same thing, because then it would be much more credible. We're working with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, who are very interested in the circular economy and who are very interested in the nutrient circular economy. It's one of the things we're trying to encourage them to do. A lot of these job figures, I think, are very estimative. In the end, what works is you just have to think about it a bit. Firstly, it's about maintaining the jobs that are there, because if you can't get rid of your manure, you have to close your farm. So that's simple. And then if you're going to have recycling, you know, these installations need someone to run them. But it is actually very difficult to put a real figure on the jobs.
Anita Ragmi, OCP Research. It's very interesting, your presentation. Sort of a related question I had is how applicable directly some of the systems you described in Europe would be in the US because of the policy incentive differences. When you were mentioning some organic farms and low-input farms, I'm kind of aware the amount of direct payments that go to maintain that. And so some of this making it a completely, a cyclical economy, etc., they are inherently different policy systems. And maybe as this group thinks through those, we may have to think through those issues as well.
Yes, it is in Europe, a lot of it is regulation driven. The regulation in Europe is increasingly flexible rather than end of pipe. I think the overall objective is shared. You know, we need to clean up the Chesapeake Bay, we need to clean up the Great Lakes, and behind that, actually, if you look in Europe, phosphorus is the most important factor preventing surface waters achieving good quality status. And so there's still a very, very large amount of money going into wastewater treatment to clean up phosphorus. And in Europe, just as in the US, there's a lot of thinking saying it may be cheaper rather than trying to get the sewage works down from 0.5 to 0.2 to 0.1 to work on some of the other sources, on buffer strips, on reducing soil erosion, on, you know, so there's a real need to get there, whether it's done by regulation, whether it's done by economic incentives. But the US does have the same issues, and the areas in the US where there are a lot of feeding lots for cattle, where the poultry production is concentrated, have exactly the same issues as the Netherlands, as Brittany, which, you know, where did my examples come from? Where Europe has concentrated all its livestock production. I could have shown the same map that I showed for eutrophication for livestock production. In Europe, it's all concentrated in 5 or 6, not all, but a huge concentration in 5 or 6 regions. The US has got the same. South Carolina, Delaware, whatever it is, the county where all the chickens are. And so in those areas, there will reach a point where you have to do something to move the manure further away. And you can process it. If you can recover the energy, that can be economic.
Okay, we're going to take one more. Jumbo.
Yeah, okay. Maybe we'll do 2 more.
2 more,
Can you do
okay.
a quick one?
Thanks, Chris. So I think the big challenge is how to couple the plant production with the animal production. In European country, you give a very good example showing how to recycling the manure back to the field. So based on the treat ash and then some products. But this situation is quite different from China. So in China at the moment, the chemical fertilizer company is very, very overproduction. So now they suffer very much from the market. So most of the company related to the chemical fertilizer is, you know, so they got big challenge at the moment. So when we talk about the recycling of the manure back to the field, for example, in China, that is a big issue, big challenge. So that means the products, the company don't like to do this kind of business based on the, okay, the price will goes up compared with the chemical fertilizer. But of course, the environment will get benefit. So my comments, I would like to say, so the government should link this with the policymaker to do the regulate, and then to encourage the manure or waste products return to the field. So, any comments or suggestion for how to do this? Okay, how to combine or integrate plant production and animal production? I think the United States situation quite similar to China. So the dairy farm very close to the big city, but cereal crops far away from the city. So this is the transport. In China now, if your products transport 300 kilometer, that's the price goes up. So that's a big challenge for the business. So any comments for this?
Various comments. Firstly, yes, manure. The big question is, do you move the animals and spread them out like they used to be? It's not just about cost, it's about societal structure. There are all sorts of reasons for concentrating livestock production, and China's doing it, everywhere's doing it. once you've done that, you then have the problem that you can't just spread the manure on the field. Why are the Brittany farmers processing their manure? Because they're no longer allowed to spread it all in Brittany, because it resulted in algae growing, and then horses died on the beaches, and these are tourist beaches. And, you know, so the driver is the need to get rid of the manure. And Copel, who are processing that manure, are having a hard time at the moment because the farmers pay the price of the mineral fertilizers. They look on internet and they say, how much is MAP and DAP for nitrogen and phosphorus? That's what I'll pay you for your product. And that's significantly lower than it was some time ago. But in the end, they've got to process the manure. So the challenge is about getting it into a form with low water content. And you can do that maybe by going to biochar, you can do it by precipitating products, you can do it by drying it. This works for Copel because they've got spare energy from the anaerobic digestion, and also because they situate the pelletizing next to their slaughterhouse, where they've got a lot of spare energy because they have to burn all the class 1 animal wastes, the brains, the things which you are not allowed to do anything with. So they've got spare energy which they're using for the drying. If they didn't have that energy, it would not be economic.
Okay, I'll keep this quick. I know everyone wants to get lunch. What are your thoughts, or what role do you think consumer preference or consumer education plays as far as moving sustainable phosphorus along?
Okay, yeah, well, that's good, because that was actually the last thing I was going to say in the last question, is a number of people have looked in Europe about consumer preference for food. Something like 10% of consumers are prepared to pay for organic products. Something like 50% of consumers will buy the cheapest pork in the plastic packet on the supermarket shelf. But around 40% are willing to pay an added value for something. It may be animal rights, it may be environmental quality. They don't want to go as far as organic, but there is an added value there. Now, the question is how you put a label on that added value, and how the consumer is willing to pay for it. Not all consumers, 40%, but that's a big market, and maybe the 50% will remain for imported, will remain for meat coming from elsewhere. So how do you put the label on that system and carry that through? And work is ongoing on that, because the farmers can see that they're not going to stay in business selling to the consumers who buy the cheapest, because then the price is so low that, So I think there is really the whole consumer education that you need to be prepared, if you can afford it, to pay a bit more for your food and to look at what it's made of, what is the environmental quality, what is the impact of that. And it's in all of our interest.
Great. Thank you, Chris.